But thank you all so much for joining us for the tragic tale of Salem's witchcraft hysteria. The 1692 Salem trials are infamous for being the greatest witch hunt in American history. Untangle the tragic tale of Salem's witchcraft hysteria. Explore the perfect storm of factors that led to these disastrous events, including religious discord, political factionalism, the worst weather of the century, and an abject failure of leadership. We're going to examine the decisions made by Massachusetts leaders, including Salem's local ministers, the panel of 9 judges who heard the trial, as well as the governor who appointed them. And this is all led by Salem witch trials historian Dr. Emerson Tad Baker, who's a professor of history at Salem State University, and he's the author of 2 books on the topic, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and the American Experience, as well as The Devil of Great Island, Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. And moments ago, folks, I learned that Tad once served as an executive director of the York Institute Museum and the Dyer Library, so a former library director as well. And Tad is so famous that he has his own Wikipedia page. So all nearly 200 of us who are watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Tad for joining us this evening. And Tad, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Robert, for that wonderful introduction. And some of it's even true. So welcome, folks. It's great to have a good crowd here from so many places far and near, and lots of places I know quite well. So keep in mind that what we're talking here is kind of about a universal. We're going to talk mostly about the Salem witch trials tonight. But witch hunts and witch trials are kind of a universal of society. Almost every society has some form of witch hunts. And a matter of fact, in Europe and her colonies during what's known as the Great Age of Witch Hunts from around 1400 to around the American Revolution, about 100,000 people were accused and tried for witchcraft, and roughly half of them were executed. The numbers are round figures because, frankly, in some cases, we just don't have all the names and we don't really have all the numbers. To give you an idea, though, some of these outbreaks were so huge, it was hard to sort of track those figures. One of the biggest took place in Cologne, Germany, and it lasted a decade from 1625 to 1626 to 1635. And about 2,000 people died in that one outbreak. And so Salem is really not the biggest by far. And it's not the latest either, because we know that we had these things going on continuing well into the 18th century. And in Hungary alone in the 18th century, about 800 people were executed for witchcraft. And as I say, if you look at most cultures throughout time, they have some version of witch trials. So Salem is by that sense really not really unique at all. New England had many witch hunts even before Salem. More than 100 people were accused of witchcraft in New England before the Salem witch trials in 1692. And as a matter of fact, from 1647 to 1688, 13 people were executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And in fact, before Salem, more witches were executed in Connecticut than in Massachusetts. Where Salem is kind of different, though, and I think the reason Salem is really kind of notorious is because in most of these hunts, only 1 or 2 people are accused of witchcraft, and then it'll fizzle out. It will die. So there certainly seems to have been something different about Salem to cause so many people to be arrested and tried and executed for witchcraft. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, as to what kind of makes Salem unique. But again, by European standards, not so big, right? So in Salem, we have over 900 documents that survive for the witch trials. I think one reason we know Salem so well is because it is so well documented. But in this case too, we even know that probably some records were destroyed, probably quite deliberately in the aftermath, from people who were sort of embarrassed that they or their family were involved in such things. Of all those people, we know that we have legal proceedings that survive against 156, and another, again, like 18 people who were informally what I call cried out upon. That is, they were accused of witchcraft by a neighbor or something, but they never were charged. We'll see particularly, too, if you were someone like the governor's wife, that kind of happened. 19 people were executed. 1 was pressed to death, and at least 5 died in jail. So again, though, but by European standards, Salem is not even a large outbreak. And I don't mean to diminish the anguish and the suffering, the trauma, frankly, that lasted for generations amongst the victims of the Salem witch trials. Because in fact, I found out when I was writing the book that one of the victims, Dr. Roger Toothaker, was my ninth great uncle. So it's in my family. I think it's, frankly, though, in New England history, probably, if you weren't related to it in some way like that, probably the person sitting next to you or your boss or your friend is. So it really is kind of our story. And maybe that help explains a bit about why Salem is the witch city. I mean, I've been to Cologne, Germany, and it's a beautiful city, an amazing cathedral, nice people. No one calls Cologne the witch city. I didn't even realize that there was any witchcraft there until I started researching this. So what is it about Salem? And that's one thing when I wrote this book on Storm of Witchcraft that I really wanted to try to figure out was what was so special about Salem that everywhere you go around the world, people would say, oh, you teach at Salem State, the witch city. Wow, so why is Salem the witch city? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. But I think one of the reasons is it really signals a major change and shift in American history. One reason the historians are really interested in witchcraft is because witchcraft takes place at times of change and crisis in society. And historians are really interested in examining those sorts of changes. And so in this case, really, the Salem witch trials really suggest the beginning of the end of Puritan New England, for reasons we'll discuss. And related to the beginnings, I would say the beginnings of our distrust in government, and really the first massive failure of the government to protect the innocent. And in fact, not only do they fail to protect the innocent, but they try to cover up their guilt in this affair. So I think that there was a lasting trauma on the colony that people would not forget and would not let anybody forget, particularly the families of the victims, right? The victims and their families, they continued to try to make reparations and amends, to get pardons, reversals of attainder, damages from the government of Massachusetts. The last lawsuit was filed by one of the victims' families in the late 1740s, over 50 years after the trials. Children and grandchildren of the victims were still trying to make the state, or then the state, make amends. And in fact, only last summer did the Elizabeth Johnson Jr., the last woman to be pardoned of all the people convicted of witchcraft in Salem. So it's been a long process. It's well over 325 years to try to achieve kind of healing for this. So in this sense, I think people, in this way, Salem is really notorious. And as we'll say, in some ways, every generation has its Salem moment ever since in American history. So it's kind of a frame of reference for us as well. So what happened? Well, a perfect storm of witchcraft created America's largest witch hunt. And in fact, that's why I get the title of my name, A Storm of Witchcraft. I really kind of equated to that other perfect storm, that other Essex County tragedy, the destruction of the fishing fleet in this storm, which had all these horrible factors come together to create this large killer storm. You really have to have a lot of abnormal things happen to create this huge witchcraft outbreak where you have so many people accused, right? Because normally, again, one or two people might be accused and then it would fizzle out. Factors are both local in Salem Village and also colony-wide. Now, probably folks locally may know this, but others from away may not. But the action in the Salem witch trials starts, and most of the accusations, at least initially, takes place in what was then called Salem Village, which today is actually the neighboring town of Danvers, Massachusetts, and actually Peabody, city of Peabody as well. And it's kind of ironic today because all the hubbub and celebration, if you will, and I use that term celebration advisedly because I'm not a real fan of that given the circumstances. But all the kind of haunted happenings and events that take place today that take place in the city of Salem, which Salem is known for. And the only part of the crisis that took place in Salem really were the trials and the jail and the execution. But in Salem Village is really kind of this powder keg of dissent and disagreement. There's longstanding village factionalism. In 1692, the town is actually on its fourth minister in like 20 years. just almost unheard of, because back then a minister might graduate from Harvard and then spend his whole career, 30, 40, 50 years or more, in the same town. But Salem was filled with people arguing over who their minister should be, exactly what type of Puritan faith they wanted, what worked and what didn't, and also economic disagreements, just a bunch of disagreements. As one resident wrote in complaining to one of the ministers, it's neighbor against neighbor, it's brother against brother, right? Well, that's one factor that might have led to one or two accusations of witchcraft, but you need larger factors than that to really make this thing take wings. And at the same time this is going on, you have colony-wide political instability. We have in late January 1692, Salem Village learns, and the rest of Massachusetts learns, that a new governor, Sir William Phipps, will be arriving in Massachusetts that spring with a new charter that is a whole new form of government. And people are really worried about what this means. Is this going to be the end of the Puritan experiment, the Puritan city upon a hill, right? And so that kind of political instability is a major factor in witch trials as well. Whenever you have political instability, people always are worried that the government won't be able to protect them. And so sometimes they start taking things into their own hands. And that's particularly true in the 1690s, which is a time when the Puritans of Massachusetts were very much worried about what we historians call Puritan declension, Puritan decline. We're talking about by now the second and third generation of Puritans who'd first come over in the 1620s and 30s to Massachusetts and to Plymouth and to Connecticut. And, each generation is different. And I think maybe in many ways we all respect our parents. We all want to be like our parents, but we're all different. And that second and third generation wanted to be good Puritans and devout, but they seem somehow kind of lacked that spiritual conviction, that fire in the belly. They weren't sure if God was speaking to them or not. And it really kind of created this crisis of declining membership of the church and fewer children being baptized into the faith. And people were really worried. Now, I think the fact that people were so upset about this suggests the decline of Puritanism was more perceived than real, but it was a factor nonetheless. And especially, too, when you realize that in the 17th century, before the age of science, Puritans believed in the divine providence and awesome power of God, and that everything that happened could be a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure, right? So when you have thunderstorms or lightning striking your house or comets, those are signs of God's displeasure. So imagine in the 1690s, we now know is the worst weather of the entire Little Ice Age, a process that lasts several hundred years. But the 1680s and 1690s have the coldest, worst winters, killer frosts in the spring that kill crops, dry, hot summers that also will now kill crops. And if anything's left, there are frosts in August before you can harvest the crops. So what happens when that you have starvation, you have hunger, you have inflation, and again, this is a sign of God's displeasure, right? So maybe God is angry at Puritans for breaking their special covenant. And of course, when you have those sorts of things going wrong, you also have inflation, high taxes, economic failure. And at the same time, as we'll talk about, there's a war going on the frontier between the English colonists of Massachusetts and Maine, which was part of Massachusetts at the time, and the Wabanaki, the native peoples of northern New England, and their French allies who lived up in Quebec and in the maritime provinces of what's now Canada. So you've got all these factors coming together that really lead to these accusations in many ways, right? But I will say one thing, we'll get to this later, because I know someone will ask if I don't. It was not ergot poisoning. That had nothing to do with it, all right? Or virtually nothing to do with it. Okay. So also, too, as Robert suggested, we really did have a failure of leadership. My book is sort of written in this series on pivotal moments in American history, and they look very much at the issue of contingency, that human agency, right? We're not trying to do counterfactual history, but how might things have changed if people had acted differently or made different decisions, right? And if you look at the Salem witch trials, there are multiple times, sort of inflection points throughout 1692, when someone was in a position to make a different decision that could have diffused the situation. In the spring and summer of 1692, local officials could have certainly diffused things. It's Reverend Paris and the local doctor and other ministers who see the affliction of his daughter and niece as bewitchment. That's a hard thing to diagnose, and they didn't have to make that diagnosis. But when Paris does, and really starts preaching these fire and brimstone sermons and riles up the community, things are going to spread, particularly when he may have taken steps to basically force his enslaved Native American woman Tituba to confess to witchcraft. Right? He thinks he may have threatened to beat her, or may have even beaten her into confessing. And once she confesses and says there are 9 witches loose in Salem, all bets are off. Right? This is no small outbreak, and things are going to grow. How about over the course of the summer, the 9 judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the witch trials court, could have changed things, didn't have to accept the verdicts of their juries, right? But they did. And I really sort of blame the judges, particularly the Chief Justice William Stoughton, who was also the deputy governor of the colony, for really rushing to judgment in many of these trials when he could have brought an end to it fairly quickly. And finally, the governor could have stopped things too, Governor William Phipps, and he never does. So there really is kind of a failure of leadership here and accountability of people to stand up and do the right thing, and to have the moral courage to do that. And if people want to make any parallels to government of America now, or basically any time since, again, every generation kind of has its Salem moment where we need strong leaders who are willing to do the right thing, and to do the right thing is not always necessarily popular, right? Anyhow, and believe me, I'm not taking political sides here. I'm talking across the spectrum. So what about the accusations? What caused the afflictions and the accusations? What actually happened? Well, it's a long, complicated story, and there are no simple answers, but I'll try to give you a brief summary of some of the key things. And meanwhile, I thought I'd throw up an image of one of my favorite movies about such things, The Witch. I'm not big into horror movies, but The Witch is one of the most suspenseful movies I've seen, and it's the best depiction I've seen of witchcraft in early New England. And the material culture, the clothing, the buildings, everything is just spot on. So if you want to get a good visual idea of what this life was like, highly recommend you see The Witch. So variety of factors here going on. One of the key ones is what's known as mass conversion disorder. Now, I am not a psychiatrist, nor do I play one on television or a clinician. And I would say this is a condition that's hard to diagnose today, and so much more difficult to diagnose when you're dealing with patients who've been dead for 300 years. But the symptoms are really interesting. Conversion disorder is where you suffer so much stress and anguish and fear, anxiety, that your anxieties basically take over. Your mind takes over your body, doesn't bother to tell your body, which makes it even more scary to you, because you don't understand why it feels like someone's sticking a dozen pins at you at once, or why you're barking like a dog, or threatening to throw yourself into the fireplace in the roaring fire. Because what's happened is your mind has just taken over and is kind of in this way, sort of in some ways acting out your symptoms. But I want to make it clear that the Reverend Parris's daughter and his niece, Betty and Abigail, who are the first to be afflicted, may have been suffering from this, but they are no way acting out or faking their symptoms. They are literally terrified. They don't understand why their bodies are doing this. They don't know what's happening. Really, they see this as someone doing something to them. They see it as witchcraft. So that just makes it worse, right? Now, what's interesting with conversion disorder, which again can sort of grow and spread and become kind of mass conversion disorder. The conversion disorder, we know from cases today, the target population is really teenagers, especially teenage girls. And folks, I think we put our girls and young women through an awful lot in our society today, very demanding. And when I saw my daughter's first Barbie dolls, I realized how impossible the standard maybe we were setting for them. But frankly, Puritan society in 17th century Massachusetts was worse. It was a patriarchal society, male dominated by the ministers and the fathers of the family. Women had no legal rights. And particularly, children were supposed to be seen and not heard, that old New England expression, right? And also even spare the rod, spoil the child was another one that they believed in. So life could be very tough for children, and particularly for young girls. And so you can see where you'd have this kind of situation. You might have a conversion disorder. And it's interesting because there's a modern example of it. About 8 or 10 years ago, there was a case of it in Leroy, New York. And it turns out that conversion disorder, people sort of get it by powers of suggestion, right? So, for example, in Leroy, New York, who are the first people to be afflicted? It was several of the cheerleaders, which in many high schools, they're sort of the top of, they and the quarterbacks and the star football players are at the top of the sort of social pecking order, right? And sure enough, as soon as that happened, then in Leroy, it sort of goes down and out throughout the high school. And pretty soon you have, several dozen kids who are shrieking out in assembly and behave strangely and not really understand why they're doing this. Salem in the 17th century was the same way. Who's the most important family, the most prestigious family in town? Reverend Parris and his family. So when his daughter and niece become afflicted, the powers of suggestion being very, very strong, pretty soon their friends and neighboring children start having the same kinds of symptoms. So again, the parallels are clear, but this just, there's got to be lots more going on. There isn't one single thing that describes this. Because in point of fact, though, I do want to point out that witchcraft is very much of a gendered crime, right? Throughout history, again, through all societies, most societies tend to be patriarchal, especially pre-modern societies. And throughout history, about 3/4 of the people accused of witchcraft are women. In Salem, it's actually about 76%, so right about the same. And it's actually worse than that because the men who are accused of witchcraft oftentimes are relatives of those women who are accused or their defenders. And people start to say, hey, wait a second. Why are you defending? You seem to be a God-fearing Christian, a upright member of our community. Why are you defending Rebecca Nurse? We all know she's a witch. What's that say about you? See? So that's how it grows, right? And again, it starts with women who are considered to be the weaker vessel in Puritan New England, who are more susceptible to Satan's wiles and attacks on their souls, right? And in fact, in Salem, the key circle of afflicted people were girls mostly between ages of about 12 and 20, but also too there were a couple of women involved. Plus, there was one man, John Indian, who was the Parris's enslaved Native American, excuse me. And even one of the judge's sons, Judge Corwin's son, is afflicted. Now, by the way, they didn't have conflict of interest laws, so normally, today that would mean that Judge Corwin would not have tried the case, but they didn't have such things back then. One of the number of many legal irregularities that took place. But also, too, I should point out, if you read, and again, you go online if you want to look this up. Just Google the University of Virginia's website put together by my friend Ben Ray, who's another leading historian of the witch trials. Google University of Virginia Salem witch trials, and it'll take them to his site where you can look up every document in the Salem witch trials. They're all transcribed online, and you can get a sense of them, and you can see the numerous several hundred people who will accuse people not teenage girls, but adult men and women, and they're not accusing people specters of afflicting them. They're accusing Rebecca Nurse of causing their pig to sicken and die, or their husband to become sick, or all kinds of strange maladies and illnesses and things, causing storms that destroy crops. Because this is what witchcraft is all about. It's about malevolent evil that can take any kind of form. It can be harming people, harming their property, using image magic, or what we call voodoo dolls, where you stab a nail into a little doll that's like one of the victims. And so a range of things that, again, you read through the trials, you get an idea. There's a lot more going on there. The first accused, though, I would say in Salem, like elsewhere, are what I call the usual suspects, just like Casablanca, round up the usual suspects. Witchcraft tends to be a working class crime. And it only usually oftentimes involved sort of accusations. Belief in witches is omnipresent in the early modern period, but it only rises to accusations usually when things are going really badly in the town, and also usually when the leading members of society are involved. In this case, when the afflicted happen to be the daughter and niece of the minister, all of a sudden accusations start, right? But usually the people who are accused of witchcraft and who are doing the accusing, at least initially, oftentimes they're sort of working class folk, sort of witchcraft is one of those crimes that takes place on the wrong side of the tracks, okay? So let's look at the first three people who were accused. We're talking about Tituba, who is the enslaved Native American owned by Reverend Parris. So again, at the really bottom of the pecking order, we're talking about Sarah Good, who's a poor, homeless, distempered woman, beggar. She and her husband don't own a home. She and her husband and their children sort of go from door to door begging. And when Reverend Paris denies her some charity, she goes away muttering, and Reverend Paris thinks she's been cursed. And her husband, when she's arrested, makes a really bad joke, sort of, I guess, typical maybe dad humor. When he's asked to testify, he said, well, my wife, Sarah Good, is an enemy to all good. Get it? Yeah, no, they thought he was serious. But also, too, they're this poor couple with nothing going for them. And that's the kind of people that get accused. Then there's Sarah Osborne, who's the third of the first three. And she was widowed, middle-aged, actually around in her 40s. She's widowed. And normally she wouldn't have been accused of witchcraft. But once her husband dies, not long afterwards, she frees and marries her Irish indentured servant, a younger man. And doing this scandalizes her family, right? And all of a sudden, people are beginning to wonder about, here's the thing. Witchcraft is a lot about scapegoating, right? People who are different. And all of a sudden, people said, that's Sarah Osborne. I knew there was something about her, right? Yeah, look at this. But over time in Salem, so normally it would just be the first three people, right? And then there might be a trial and someone might be executed. Probably not, more often than not. And it would all sort of die down. But over time in Salem, the accusations spread outward and upward. And in part it is, when poor Tituba is forced into confessing and they say, did you sign Satan's book? He said, well, yeah. Okay, how many other names were in there? I saw 9. 9? You mean we have at least 9 witches in Salem? Oh my gosh, we were right. There's a big witch hunt here that we need to take place to get rid of all these witches, and Satan is in our midst and we have to fight to get him out. So, whoops, that's kind of how it spreads. All right here. So, the afflicted girls, those girls at the center, those 8 or 10 girls, lead tough, afflicted lives. Really stressful. Again, most of them are in their mid to late teens. Many of them are servants in working for richer families in Salem and Salem Village. Some of them are war refugees, so some of them are orphans. Some have lost a parent in the war or have a brother off fighting. So they're sort of traumatic. Again, they're sort of the bottom of the pecking order. And one of them even lost. Mercy Short is kind of one of the famous ones here. She loses her family, or most of her family, in a Native American raid on Salmon Falls, present-day Berwick, in South Berwick, Maine, in 1690. And her parents are killed. Some of her siblings are killed. She and some of her siblings and some of the neighborhood kids are marched off into captivity in Quebec. Her farm's destroyed. And eventually she's ransomed by Governor Phipps back to Massachusetts. But her life is gone. Her family is gone. Their prosperity is gone. And she's a lowly house servant for a wealthy Boston widow. And when that widow asked her to take some food in 1692 to a friend who's locked up in the Boston prison, Mercy is cursed by Sarah Good. And at that point, Mercy literally flips out. She becomes afflicted. And we're fortunate that her minister is Cotton Mather, and he wrote down his efforts to try to heal her. And he says, okay, so did Satan tempt you? Well, yes. What did Satan look like? She says, well, he was a black man. Well, actually, no, he was tawny, like an Indian. And then she goes on to read, in some ways, kind of describe that horrible moment in her life when she lost her family, when her life changed. And again, it seems pretty clear in this case that she is suffering from what we classify as PTSD, right? This huge traumatic event that has been sort of triggered back into her memory based on the situation in 1692. So these girls in these lowly conditions certainly suffered verbal abuse and probably physical abuse, because again, back then, to curse out your servant for if they weren't doing their job properly, or maybe even cuff them around a bit if they weren't doing the job right, it certainly happened and it was permissible. Because again, like, corporal punishment was okay in limited doses, right? And particularly both, by parents the fathers and the mothers who kind of ruled those households, right? And frankly, it's even possible there might have been sexual abuse. We can't prove it, but let me tell you a story or two here and see what you think. So the specters of most of the men executed in 1692 that is their spirits, their ghosts, were accused by the afflicted girls, who in many cases were the servants of those men, right? Were accused of, they accused the specters of their masters of harming them, of beating them. And on the one hand, think about this. First off, these girls have no real legal standing normally. And if their master was beating them, no one would pay any attention to them. But so if their specter does afflict them, and that's witchcraft, and that's something different, and people begin to pay attention. But to some degrees, it becomes a little more believable when you realize that in the court records from 1692 and from before, most of these men had some kind of record towards violence and really sort of a controlling nature. John Willard is actually in the trial records in 1692. His wife talks about him beating her to within an inch of her life, to the part where she has to run from the house to his uncle's houses to get protection. Right. So this is dangerous stuff. George Burroughs, who's considered to be, he's a Puritan minister and considered to be kind of the leader of Satan's black masses in 1692. He had lost 2 wives. He's on his 3rd wife. So this is not uncommon in the 17th century. Particularly women often died in childbirth. There was a terrible reality. But the afflicted girls said they saw George Burroughs' 2 deceased wives. He saw their ghosts in their bloody burial shrouds come to them and say that George killed them. Now, again, normally you might not believe that about a Puritan minister, but George was known for his secret, controlling ways and his great, almost supernatural strength. And the fact that one of his wives who died, when she tried to write letters home to her father, he insisted on reading them first and censoring them to make sure that she wasn't saying anything bad about him. So people that could believe the worst about George Burroughs. Maybe he did have violence towards his wife. What about someone like Giles Corey? Giles Corey is maybe one of the more famous victims. He's an 80-year-old who's pressed to death. He pleads not guilty, but then when they say, "Are you willing to accept a trial by the country?" That is a jury trial. He just won't speak because, everyone else who'd pled not guilty is convicted, sentenced, and executed. So he just doesn't want to behave. So he's a stubborn old guy. And he certainly no one deserves to be pressed to death. But folks, Giles Corey was not a nice guy. In 1675, he had used his walking stick to severely beat his young, simple-minded servant, Jacob Goodell. And at the time, he's found guilty of manslaughter because Goodell lingers but dies a few days after he beats him. So he's found guilty of manslaughter and fined and kind of literally gets away with murder, right? And by the way, he's later on accused of committing arson, trying to set fire to his neighbor John Proctor's house. So not the nicest of guys. And isn't it interesting? In 1692, it's Corey's apparition, his spirit, who beats the afflicted girls with his staff, just like he himself had beat Jacob Goodell in 1675. Perhaps he's used that staff to beat his own servant, who's one of the afflicted girls, right? Or take John Proctor, the famous guy of the Crucible. The Crucible is not good history. There's lots of inaccuracies. Great play. And in fact, Abigail Williams was a little girl who did not have a love affair with him. In fact, it didn't work for him. But he did have a servant, a 20-year-old servant, Mary Warren, and she does accuse John and John Spector both of threatening violence against him. And in fact, in court in 1692, he admits saying that he was going to thresh the devil out of her. He thought all these witch accusations were nonsense. And when Mary became afflicted, he said, "I'm going to take her home and I'm going to threaten to beat her. And I think she'll stop being afflicted once I do that." And in fact, for a time she did. Isn't it interesting, though, when she becomes afflicted again, she says that Proctor's specter is threatening her with hot fire tongs. And in fact, he admitted in court that he himself had threatened to burn that fit out of her. It's like, you better stop this or else, right? Also, too, though, he calls Mary his jade, which is a 17th century term, like an old nag, could be an old broken down horse. But it was also used for a term for a woman of ill repute, right? For a prostitute. So here's this guy who's like 60 years old. His wife is at home pregnant, and he's talking about going to fetch his jade. That's mildly kind of disquieting, right? That kind of reference. And even more so is this one situation where when Mary is testifying, she talks about having John Spector. She's sitting in the chair. I think she's doing some work, and John Spector comes up to her, and she takes his specter and pulls his specter onto her lap. Icky kind of stuff here, and it makes you wonder if there might be some sexual tension, some sexual violence going on in that relationship. And again, we'll never be able to prove it, right? So conversion disorder, PTSD, abuse, war hysteria, don't explain it all. We certainly know there had to be some fraudulent accusations. As a matter of fact, if you read the court record, you can see it. And it's probably more than we'd like to admit, because we like to think the best, especially of our children and our young adults, that they're not going to deliberately fabricate evidence. But it's interesting because the afflicted seem to become afflicted on cue, right? As if they're doing it quite deliberately at times. But here's the problem, and I think, Mary Warren's a good example of this. She early on comes to her senses and said, wow, I don't know what came over me, and I can't believe I accused these people of witchcraft, but I'm better now, but these girls, they're out of their minds and don't pay any attention to them. Well, guess what happens? They start accusing Mary of being a witch, at which point she decides to go back and just be afflicted and to avoid being accused of witchcraft. But the point is, folks, so in other words, if you were suffering from some disorder and got better over the course of 1692, after June 10th, you have to just play along, because after June 10th, Bridget Bishop is executed. So you can't wake up on June 11th and say, oh my God, Judge Saltonstall, I can't believe what we did. This is terrible. These people are sick, because now you've killed somebody, right? So you have to go along. And there certainly was some of that. There really was no turning back, especially after June 10th. So you've got all these kinds of factors, right, that are certainly there. But I can say for sure that ergot poisoning was not one of the factors. Excuse me. Massachusetts, ergot poisoning. This is that idea of that people were eating moldy bread or moldy grain. And it's certainly true that if you take a rye grain and it's stored and gets damp and gets mold on it, that mold produces ergot. And ergot, which is a poison, but it's also the natural form of LSD. This idea came forward first in around 1970, was this idea that these afflicted girls were maybe they were just having bad trips, right? And that they were just eating the same grain, and that's what caused it, right? Well, here's the problem. And you can see here on the screen what ergot looks like, these blackened growths on rye, which is people would make into bread. But here's the problem. First off, you'd have to have a communal grain supply for all of Massachusetts, because you have people who were afflicted in Andover and Boston, as well as Salem Village. And why is it that only one or maybe two or at most three people in a family are afflicted and not the whole family if they're eating the same grain supply? So it doesn't make sense from that point of view. And it also doesn't make sense from the symptoms, right? Because if you look here, the hands there, that's someone suffering from ergot. And essentially with ergot, you basically get gangrene where your limbs blacken, shrivel, fall off, and you die. No symptoms were observed like that in 1692, and they're pretty jarring, and I think would have been recorded. And in fact, all but one or two of the afflicted girls seem to have lived long lives. So it certainly didn't do that. And also, the disease process doesn't fit. If you are being poisoned, you continually get worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Well, in 1692, the afflicted girls seemed perfectly normal until they were brought into a courtroom. And then when one of the accused witches would come in, all of a sudden the afflictions would begin. And when the witch was let out, the afflictions would stop. So it doesn't really follow the right process either. Again, what we're really talking about here, again, think about this, first published in 1970. By the way, almost immediately dismissed within 6 months. And it keeps on coming back, and we can't sort of drive a stake in its heart, so to speak, right? But it's really, to me, sort of the 1960s and 70s Timothy Leary, LSD, hippy-dippy days, in interpretation of Salem, right? But I also think that the thing is, like, our society today really looks for simple explanations, particularly can they involve science? Or can, if I'm sick, can I just take one pill to make me better? I don't want to change my lifestyle and actually, lose weight or eat better or, exercise. Can you just give me a pill? Can't we have a simple explanation, right? Okay, is it possible that one or two people might have had something like this? Again, you said, Professor Baker, it's a storm of factors. Yeah, it's certainly possible, but I don't think it explains it. And also, too, I don't believe in other real medical conditions, like encephalitis or Lyme disease, that have been put forward by other students of this. Okay, so where are we? The accusations also too were not made to get people say like, well, okay, it wasn't ergot, but it was they were trying to get their neighbor's land, because if they told the court that their neighbor was a witch, then they'd get their neighbor's farm. Sorry, no such luck. There is a bit of truth in this though, right? And like with ergot, yes, if someone is convicted of felony, their personal possessions, clothes, cash, furniture, livestock could be seized, right? But their house and all real estate, even if they're executed, could not be taken and would pass to their heirs, right? And it's like we learn on every April 15th, the actual only winner is the government, right? Because in 1692, when there were seizures, all of the assets went to the crown, to the governor of Massachusetts, and ultimately to the king and the queen back in England, right? So it wasn't like there was a finder's fee for accusing your neighbor of being a witch. Now, that doesn't mean you might not be envious of your neighbor with a rich neighbor with a nice farm, but accusing them of witchcraft was not going to get you that farm. So those are just some of the factors. And again, there's lots of things going on here. But when I wrote my book, one of the things that no one else had really looked at that I really wanted to focus on were the judges, because I thought, this is English law, and you have juries, you have grand juries, you have trial juries, and you could have a miscarriage of justice from a jury. I mean, we see it happen today, right? And the wrong verdict come in, but you got a panel of 9 learned judges here, and they have to sign the death warrant. They have to accept that verdict, right? So I really wanted to look closely at the judges and understand their behavior. And what's really interesting in 1692 is that for the first time in the history of Massachusetts Bay, as far as I can tell, the judges were no longer the arbiters of the truth. Now, at the time, there were no lawyers practicing as defense or prosecution attorneys, so to speak. But the judges, the panel of judges, questioned all of the witnesses, questioned the accused, questioned their accusers, and their job was to ferret out the truth, to protect the innocent, and to punish the guilty. So these were not normally kangaroo courts. But look at the first day of first pretrial hearings in 1692, when Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestor, Judge Haythorne, questions poor Sarah Good. And he doesn't start with, tell us what happened. Why are they accusing you of witchcraft? No, he says, no. What evil spirit have you familiarity with? Have you made no contract with the devil? Why do you hurt these children? He might as well have asked, when did you stop beating your husband, right? These are leading questions, and it's clear at this point that the judges have determined that Satan is in their midst, that the witches that are being tried are guilty, and it is their job to round up the witches and to inflict justice on them, and that is going to save the colony. So I kind of started to try to look into them a bit more and try to figure out why they were hanging judges, because these fellows were really turning legal precedent on its head. As I say, there'd only been one person hanged for witchcraft in like the past over 40 years in Massachusetts, and particularly too, before 1692, if you confess to witchcraft, usually after, by the way, some judicial torture, because why would you confess if the penalty is death? You were executed pretty promptly. And as recently as 1688, Goody Glover, an Irish woman living in Boston, had confessed to witchcraft and had been executed. But even in this case, the judges stopped and said, wow, she confessed. We better make sure that she's of sound mind. So they halted the trial, and then they had a panel of doctors and physicians talk to her to make sure that she was of sound mind. Because if she just says she's a witch and she's mentally ill, well, of course we're not going to execute her. We're going to try to get her help. Unfortunately, in this case, they found that she actually was of sound mind, and she was executed. I think the problem is we think she only spoke Irish, and I think she really suffered from a bad translation, bad translator. And also, too, if you think about this, if you're Irish and you're raised Catholic, they'd say, well, do you worship any other gods aside from God? Say, well, I venerate the saints. The saints, tell us more about that. What are they, right? Oh, sound like they could be demons to a Puritan at least, right? Why in 1692 do we have this amazing fact? In 1692, only those who refuse to confess are executed. This is the staggeringly sad, tragic part about Salem to me. There were 55 people who confessed to witchcraft. That's over a third of those formally accused. None of them die. Everybody who went before the court of Oyer and Terminer was tried. All are found guilty. All are sentenced to death. Right. Unfortunately, in the end, they do start. Some of the people who had pled guilty, they did start to try them. And fortunately for them, the hangings were stopped before they could die as well too. So, what does this tell us about the judges? Right. Well, first off, the 9 judges have a lot in common, and to some degrees, these folks are the 1%, maybe the 1% of the 1%. They are the wealthiest merchants of the colony. They have been named by the king and queen themselves to the new charter of Massachusetts, to the office of being an assistant to the governor. Today, that would make them a state senator, which is a pretty powerful position. So they're the richest people. They're the most powerful politicians. But also, too, at the time, if you were a member of the governor's council, you would also be a judge. So imagine that's a lot of power. And interestingly, in 1690, one of the things many of these councilors had done was support legislation calling for a campaign of moral reformation. Imagine this happening today with our division of church and state, where the legislature gets together and says, not enough people are attending church. We need to get people back into church. We need people reading the Bible. We need to closing the taverns early and one and done and then home, because Satan's loose in our colony. So these judges are strong backers of the support for moral reformation to search to root out Satan. And by the way, a majority of them, 5 out of 9, had attended Harvard. So these are well-educated individuals. Most people who went to Harvard became ministers, and some of these men had the credentials to do so, but they never did. Instead, they were just wealthy merchants. Even more interesting to me than that is 6 of the 9 are related by marriage. Look at here, and you'll see. Okay, now those of us in Massachusetts, I won't bother with any comments about nepotism in the legislature, but that's an interesting pattern, particularly too. Who's the sheriff of Essex County? Their nephew. Yeah. Other thing too that's going on here, as I mentioned, is this war on the frontier between the French, who were Catholic, who the Puritans hated. It's almost an irrational fear of the Pope and his people. And who are they in league with? The Native Americans, who were paganistic. That means the Puritans would have considered them heathen, that is, minions of Satan. And so you have these 2 forces that are winning the war. And it's not just a military and economic war, but it's really a spiritual war where these agents, the people the Puritans considered to be agents of Satan, were destroying Puritan New England, that city upon the hill. And they were going to eliminate Massachusetts Bay, that's with the aid of Satan. Okay, so isn't it interesting that most of the judges on the witchcraft court are high-ranking militia officers? One of the judges, Colonel Wayne Winthrop, is the commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts militia that's really losing this war, right? And also, too, most of these men are major land speculators who've lost sawmills and properties worth, at the time, millions of dollars that have been destroyed on the frontier. So these guys are angry. They're looking for someone to blame. And as Dana Carvey might say on the old Saturday Night Live shtick, could it be Satan? Because here's the problem, folks. It's so much easier. Human nature is to look for someone else to blame for our own problems, right? Because the judges go like, oh, it's not our fault. It's the government's fault. Oh, wait, that's us. No, it's the military. Wait, that's us too. Well, I guess it could be Satan, right? So that's the easy answer that they came up with. Now, what's interesting is only in late summer and fall of 1692 do people begin to voice their concerns with the proceedings, where they begin to think that innocent lives might have been lost. At which point, actually, Governor Phipps, rather than trying to immediately put a halt to proceedings and sort of fess up, he asks Cotton Mather, one of the leading ministers of the colony, the son of the leading minister, Reverend Increase Mather, he asks him to write a history of the trials. It's basically an apology. And what Mather does is he really whitewashes the whole proceedings. Today, he'd be on the Sunday morning talk shows kind of as a spin doctor. And the book is rushed into print so Phipps can send a copy to England and tell the king and queen that we've had these witch trials, but not to worry, no innocent lives were lost. Well, he only looks at like 5 or 6 cases out of these over 100 and sort of cherry picks the best cases and the best evidence to say that, only real witches were executed. And in fact, though, at that point, though, Governor Phipps says, well, you know what, folks, we've got the truth here. We don't need to hear from anybody else. And we have the Mather's book. And so I'm issuing a publications ban because we really don't need to hear any more criticism. It would be an indistinguishable flame of criticism. And to do so is going to risk, actually, he doesn't say this, is going to risk the new government, right? And it could be the end of Puritan Massachusetts. So guess what, folks? Government cover-up, no books published allowed, no one arguing against the government or saying how they've done wrong. I consider this publication ban, which lasted 3 years, the first large-scale government cover-up in U.S. history, hundreds of years before Watergate. And again, like most times when you're trying to cover things up like this, it only really ultimately makes it worse. It means people are never going to forget. And as I say, people refuse to let the story die. Thomas More publishes a book in 1695, the first to be critical to break the ban, and he's arrested and tried for seditious libel, but he's found not guilty. People have said, we've had enough of this. And again, some people are thinking maybe it's time to put a little more division between church and state. Maybe it isn't a great idea that Increase Mather, the leading minister of the colony, is the leading advisor to Governor Phipps. And by the way, isn't it interesting that Phipps only ends the witch trials when his wife and Increase Mather's wife are cried out upon as witches, right? At which point Phipps says, yes, I now know that some people might be innocent. Well, I think we know who he's talking about, right? And as I say, the families refuse to let people forget this. The general court debates the matter regularly as victims and their family file claims for decades. Unfortunately, though, it really took Salem 300 years to build a memorial because this was such a traumatizing event for the community. People felt guilty. Others just didn't want to hear about it. And so it's had a lasting effect. People, every generation, I think, has this kind of Salem moment. Hey, speaking of Salem, though, before I end in a minute, I just want to mention, if you get a chance, and I understand that the previous talk in this series was by the curators from the Peabody Essex Museum about their new Salem Witch Trials exhibit, Restoring Justice. Highly recommend you attend it. I actually provided them a little bit of advice on it. But you can see objects owned by people involved in the Salem witch trials like John Proctor, Rebecca Putnam. You can see Judge Corwin's chest. And the good news is, folks, it's on exhibit at the PIM in downtown Salem until November 26th. So you can wait till after Halloween, because with about 1 million tourists expected in Salem this month, boy, I kind of avoid the downtown area and try to go sort of the back way to get over to the university. But anyhow, highly recommend that if you want to get a real sense of life in 1692. So where does this leave us? How could so many people say, how could they be so dumb to believe in witches, so superstitious? Well, folks, witches were all too real in 1692. After all, they're in the Bible, the witch of Endor, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Kings, governors, popes, everybody, all God-fearing Christians believed in witches. We knew that their goal was to destroy our society, destroy our faith. They don't even have to be present to do it. They could be many, many miles away and use their powers, right, to do this. And it's almost impossible to detect this enemy. Witches could be anybody: friends, ministers, family members, politicians. Wow. Okay, well, what do you do? How do you stop them? This unseen enemy that's a real threat to destroy us. So, I honestly think that if you swap that concept of the witch in 1692, that malevolent force that's in league with Satan to destroy everything that is good and that we love, if you swap that witch, and by the way, this witch has nothing to do with the modern day Wiccan faith, people who call themselves witches, who have a wonderful, peaceful religion that talks about being kind to people and animals in the world. But these 17th century malevolent witches trying to use Satan's powers to harm people. If you think about those kinds of witches and swap those witches with the word terrorist that we face today, I think you understand the problem. How do you defeat an unseen enemy that's trying to destroy you, right? So I think that's the real problem that people faced in 1692. They weren't superstitious. They were smart, knowing people every bit as much as we are. But as I say, folks, I think kind of every moment has its Salem, every generation has its Salem moment in one ways or another. So having said that, though, we don't really believe in witches or witch hunts, or do we? And I'll say this, folks, this has got nothing about politics, because again, most recently it's been President Trump talking about witch hunts, but who was it before that? Hillary Clinton and her supporters talking about the Benghazi witch hunts, right? So, politicians left, right, and center have used this idea for a long time, and it's a way to persecute, it's a way to scapegoat, to deflect, to rush to judgment. And that's the tragedy. And frankly, I think, as long as we have those kind of injustices, I hate to say it, we're going to have some sort of witch hunt, right? So thank you very much.
So folks, let's give Tad a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And now we're going to take approximately 15 to 20 minutes of audience Q&A. You're welcome to stay with us, but if you have to drop off early, you'll receive the recording on Friday morning. So Rebecca asks, have all of those convicted been officially pardoned?
Yes, finally, as of last year, was the absolute last one when Elizabeth Johnson Jr. Was pardoned. Well, and technically is what you want, and what most of them have received is not a pardon, but a reversal of attainder. As folks may know, if you accept a pardon, you basically accept you agree to you're being convicted of the crime, but your sentence is eliminated. So, you know, that really isn't kind of good enough, frankly, then or now. So what most people, what pretty much all of the victims have received is a reversal of attainder, which means that the legislature of Massachusetts and the governor have stepped in to reverse the decisions of the court in 1692 and 1693, and saying, nope, you are not guilty, right? Which is better than a pardon. So it took a long time. I will say, too, there is an effort that started recently underway because there are other victims. Again, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there were 13 people executed for witchcraft before Salem. And there's efforts underway in Connecticut and Massachusetts to try to get those people exonerated and get a reversal of attainder as well. And you know what? Let me say this, Robert. Well, some people are saying, well, what a waste of time. You know, really, doesn't our legislature have better important things to do? Well, I realize it's an important job with lots to do. But here's the thing. Take the example of Elizabeth Johnson Jr. There were like 30 members of her extended family who were accused of witchcraft, and it ruined their lives for generations. This transgenerational trauma, that mark of your family being accused and convicted of witchcraft, right? So it seems to me it's kind of the least we could do now, 300 years later, to do something about that. And again, well, does it matter? Yes, it does. I'm sure we have a lot of descendants watching tonight, and they take the stuff very seriously. And when I was part of the group that confirmed the execution site at Gallows Hill back in 2016. And I had so many people contact me and reach out and saying, thank you, and to the city for doing this. This is unfinished business. I'm the 9th great grandson, granddaughter of so-and-so. And we've always thought this was such an injustice. And thank you for taking steps. So it really means a lot. There are hundreds of thousands of descendants of people from the witch trials, and these are important steps to them. So I think you know, in our legislature's busy schedule, they can take time to do this as well.
So in your remarks just a minute ago or so, you referenced Connecticut. Cindy would like to know where exactly in Connecticut were these witch trials that you mentioned?
Well, they were up and down the Connecticut River Valley over about a 40-year period. We're down in, I think it's actually Fairfield, down on, or Stamford area on the coast. Actually, there were a couple of people tried for witchcraft in 1692, basically as fears of witches spread in 1692, right? Most of them took place from like Northfield, Massachusetts, Springfield. There was a major witch hunt in Hartford in 1662 around there, Weathersfield. So all up and down. And if you can go online, you can actually find lists of the accused and where they lived, or some good books on witch hunts. Like in John Demos's book, Entertaining Satan, he lists all of the victims accused of witchcraft in New England in an appendix, and you can see the towns. But it's the only one there was kind of the only other large witch hunt aside from Salem was Hartford, where I think there was about 13 people accused of witchcraft in the 1660s. But it's kind of a universal phenomenon.
Barbara asks, is it true that most accused witches came from surrounding towns such as North Andover and not Salem? Yeah. And it's just the trials that took place in Salem.
And yes, and absolutely true. And Robert, thanks for putting in quote marks, because yeah, I mean, that's assumed here, right? Again, there were no people actually in league with Satan in 1692. Everybody was innocent, right? But yes, as it turns out, of course, you mentioned North Andover. In the 17th century, what is now Andover and North Andover was the one town of Andover. And actually, North Andover, actually, North Andover paid to keep the name. Andover paid to keep the name, and North Andover became North Andover, because North Andover is actually kind of the older part of the settlement. The old common in North Andover was the old center of Andover. Well, anyhow, Yes, more people from Andover were accused of witchcraft than any other town, including Salem. So to some degrees, or Danvers, right? So, or Salem Village. So it's like, again, why don't we call it the Andover witch hunt, right? So it's become Salem that's notorious. So yeah, and we have people as far away. George Burroughs is in Wells, Maine when he's brought back for trial. There was actually a case, down around Framingham of someone being accused of witchcraft and a bunch of people in Boston. So it really is a colony-wide crisis.
Let's see here. So Donna asks, could you please repeat the location or name of the website with the
Sure.
Salem witch trial historic documents?
Sure. Maybe Robert, you can put it, maybe you can enter this in the chat, but it's the University of Virginia Salem Witch Trials site. And if you just Google that, I don't have the link handy, but if you Google Salem Witch Trials, University of Virginia, it'll give you a link right to the site. And they have all kinds of records and maps and information about the witch trials, including the court records, as well as some of the histories, the early histories of it as well. Highly recommended. It's a great place. And more recently, they've actually added nice color images of all of the documents as well. So you can see those, but if you can't read 17th century handwriting, you can read a transcription. Highly recommended.
Yeah, I just put the link in the chat, so hopefully
Great.
folks can see that.
Thank you, sir.
Donna also asks, were any of the accused witches identified as having a mental illness or out of their right minds so they could receive support and help for their affliction?
Unfortunately, no. And people now in the 17th century, people did recognize people being what they call them distempered or crazed or something, some other term like that. So they certainly recognized people like that. But in this case, sort of the medical experts and the ministers came up with the definition that these people were bewitched. But having said that, most of the people we're talking about now are the ones who were bewitched, of course, were the victims, and the people they really weren't doing the diagnoses on were the ones who were accused, who were the ones again who might have acted a little strangely. You know, I like to say, Robert, if it happened today, I'd probably be one of the first to be accused. I mean, I think we all have our quirks, right? And so yes, we do know, for example, Reverend Higginson even mentioned the fact that his daughter, Anne Higginson Dolliver, who was accused of witchcraft, was simple-minded. Or actually, no, I think he said she was distempered. And in fact, actually, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., that last one to get the reversal of attainder, her grandfather, Reverend Dane of Andover, had said she's simple-ish at best. I mean, so but unfortunately, those sorts of things didn't get you off the hook. What it did do was, again, if you acted strangely, that makes you stand out. That makes you ripe for scapegoating. And unfortunately, we don't have the kind of society today that didn't sort of look to rush to judgment and harm these people, but again, to, you know, like we do now, to try to help them, right? So it's very unfortunate because a lot of these people, I think, could have been suffering from any one of a number of illnesses. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Joan has sort of a definition question. What is the definition of a specter? And what's the difference between a specter and a ghost? Are those the same thing?
Well, yeah, ghost is a more generalized term, but it's the same idea of a spirit, right? So what a specter is a spirit. And specters, again, it sounds kind of crazy to us, but people knew that Satan and witches would be given the power from Satan to create specters or spirits, and that these specters were invisible spirits. They were invisible except to the person they were harming or attacking. But even though they were invisible, they could cause physical harm. When Giles Corey's specter would swing his cane or his crutch at one of the afflicted girls, it would physically hurt them. Okay, so now what's interesting is this spectral. So it's called spectral evidence, and in most court cases, it was not used. Normally, you needed either two eyewitnesses saying that you'd seen someone convict an act of black magic, and since we all can agree that it's not real, it was kind of hard to get people to admit that even in 1692, right? Or someone to confess. But in Salem, they're so worried about witchcraft being present that they also allow spectral evidence to be used, even though the ministers are saying, you know, don't use this as your primary evidence. This is dangerous stuff. Just use it to help you, right? Because in 1692, this was controversial stuff, but not the reasons we might think. I mean, imagine an afflicted girl standing in the courtroom with some invisible specter attacking her and her screaming, and you seeing nothing. You'd think that this was nuts. That wasn't the case in 1692, because everyone knew that invisible specters could harm people. But the question was, whose specter could be used, right? And essentially, the judges were amongst the group that said, you know what? If your specter is being used to harm people, then you are corrupt, you are in league with Satan, and that's evidence of that. So therefore, you are a witch. But having said that, other people, including many learned ministers and officials and educators would say, well, wait a second. Satan is the great trickster. And what better thing for Satan to do than to use the specter of an innocent person to harm people? Because then you're causing harm, and you're also going to get an innocent, God-fearing Christian accused of witchcraft. So that's what a specter is, and that's why it was controversial. Not for the reasons we might think, but for the standard of the day, right? So in that sense, it's kind of related to a ghost, but in this case particularly, it's a ghost who's really working as an agent of Satan or of a witch.
So Tad, I'm going to read some comments, and then we'll pivot back to some last few questions. Susan says this was wonderful. Karen says great job. Anita says very interesting. TB agrees. JM says this was great. As evidenced by the banning of books like Harry Potter, there are still folks who are believers in witches and wizards. Janet says it was very interesting. Many unknown facts. Great presentation. Jean says it was excellent. Rob says fantastic job. You're getting the emoji round of applause icons there. Judy says, great presentation. Donna thanks you for the wonderful talk, as does Teresa. Tanya says, excellent. Jack loved it. June says, thank you so much. Cindy says she enjoyed the talk. It corrected some of my misunderstandings at accusations for land grabs. Donna says, thank you. Marion says, great presentation. She learned some new facts that she did not know, and she requested one of your books from her local library on Long Island. Barb says this was excellent and lively. Donnie says excellent, very informative and interesting. He learned a lot. Davida says great presentation. Osmena says one of the best presentations she's ever heard on the subject. Barbara says great presentation, so much to learn. Thank you for clarifying many of the incorrect reasons for this tragedy. So now we'll pivot back to some remaining questions. Anita asks, how old was the youngest and oldest accused?
Yes. Youngest was little Dorothy or Dorcas Good, who was 4, believe it or not, and was actually in prison for many, many months, and apparently was never of right mind the rest of her life. It's terrible. And the oldest, George Jacobs, was, I believe, 82, maybe 83. So they really ranged the gamut. Most of them would have been 50 or 60 something.
And Tad, you were able to write some of the responses, but
yep.
Let me just
feel free to read
these. Yeah, because folks can't necessarily see the answers.
I shouldn't have answered those. Sorry, Robert.
No, that's fine. I'm glad you did. But 2 more. Donna asked, were any of the accused witches of a different religion like Judaism?
Right. And the answer is actually no. There was in Massachusetts until 1684, when the first charter was revoked, the only religion allowed in the colony was Puritanism. Now, with the Dominion of New England, they allowed, by our standards, this is much latitude, but they allowed religious toleration, which meant in addition to Puritans, Quakers, Baptists, and members of the Church of England could all worship. But those were it, and basically everybody had to attend one of those services. There were no non-Christians in the colony at that time. The Jews were allowed in Rhode Island, but one of the early synagogues in America was actually built in Rhode Island. But there were no Jews or no one who would admit to being, say, a Jew or a Catholic in Massachusetts at the time. And as far as we can tell, none of the people accused were even sort of like crypto Catholics or in hiding. Yeah.
Barbara says, I recommend The Heretic's Daughter as a great dramatization of an actual accused woman from Andover. Yep. Final question, it looks like, is going to Cindy. And this also gives you an opportunity, Tad, to wrap up by plugging your books. But Cindy asks, do you go into the background and the detail of the political issues and such that you talked about at the beginning of tonight's presentation? Do you do so in your book in great detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So having said this, there are about a dozen good books on the Salem witch trials, and most of them are written by friends or scholars who I deeply respect and admire. So you kind of can't go wrong. But what I tried to do in my book was look at the big picture. What I really found is, so one of the best books written is by Boyer and Nissenbaum called Salem Possessed. And it looks very closely, puts Salem Village under a microscope. And it's brilliant in looking at the conflicts between neighbors and the minister and everything. But my point, what I said was, wait a second. If you really want to understand the witch trials, you have to look at Salem's history in the 17th century. You need the bigger picture of Massachusetts Bay and where the witch trials fit in into the crises of government in Massachusetts in the 1680s, the revocation of the charter, the dominion of New England, the Glorious Revolution, and this whole sort of growing concern over the decline of Puritanism. So those are all things I really try to look at in the bigger picture in the book. But as I say, there are lots of good books, and I recommend. I guess Dan Gagnon's next week, and he's written a really good book on Rebecca Nurse that I recommend. And I will say that I'm actually now kind of working on a sequel to A Storm of Witchcraft, which is really about transgenerational trauma and loss and healing in Salem from 1692 until today, to tell that long story of healing in the community, you know. And the other thing too is, I do talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials in my earlier book, The Devil of Great Island. But that is actually, that's a case of people find this hard to believe that it's not a novel. It's actually a history, but it's a case of a debauched Quaker tavern in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that's supernaturally assaulted by flying stones throughout the summer of 1682, and several other related cases of witchcraft that take place in that same time as well too. So if you're interested in looking at witchcraft before Salem, take a look at that. As a matter of fact, what I tell people is, you know, if you're really interested in this stuff, read that first, because it sort of sets the stage for Salem. Because Salem is so different. It's really atypical, right? And it's kind of interesting. If you want to really learn about this, you might want to start by reading like The Devil of Great Island, or John Demos's Entertaining Satan, or Professor Moyer's Detestable and Wicked Arts is really good. Carol Carlson's The Devil in the Shape of the Woman, all looking at witch trials before Salem. Or Malcolm Gaskell's most recent book, which is really, gosh, what's the name of it? The Ruin of All Witches. Really good book. And then proceed to Salem, where again there's a long list of books I highly recommend. And frankly, one comes out every year or two. And the bottom line is, folks, there never will be the definitive book on the Salem witch trials, because there's always more information coming. I don't know if people saw this today. Today, a Salem witch trials document was auctioned. It's a rare one. This one we'd seen a picture of in 1936 when it was sold through Goodspeed's, the old Goodspeed's bookshop that some of you may remember on Beacon Hill. It had been sold in 1936, and so we knew it and transcribed it. But sure enough, it showed up again this fall and just was auctioned off for $12,000 plus 28% commission. So what, about $15,000? And we don't know its whereabouts. I'd hope that it would show up in the state. We do know all these documents technically are state documents, and there was one that was found last spring that the family who had it actually gave it to the state archives, did the right thing. So again, we're always learning about this, and also too that we're learning different ways to think about this as well too. People who are writing in the 1970s, in the 1990s, and now, and 20 years from now, will keep writing books, and they'll all have different emphases and valid points. So it's good thing is I'm glad there's lots of interest, because there's plenty of stuff to read on it.
That's great. Yeah. Well, Cindy says, thanks so much. Looks forward to reading more about the history. Mary says, thanks for a great session, as does Cindy. Tad, when you publish that third book, come back. Maybe we'll even do it in person. We can do an in-person virtual hybrid situation.
Sure.
And thanks for mentioning Dan, by the way. So Dan will be speaking on Zoom next Thursday, October 26th, 7 o'clock. The name of his book is A Salem Witch: The Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse. In addition to being an author, Dan's a historian, and he serves on the board of directors of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum in Danvers, or the aforementioned Salem Village, right? So folks, let's give Our guest speaker, Tad. Another big virtual round of applause. Folks who are watching live, look for the email probably on Friday morning with a link to the recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs that might be of interest, including Dan's. I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring, and I want to thank the libraries in Groveland, Groton, and Chelmsford for partnering with Tewksbury tonight. Thanks so much, Tad, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks,
You're
everybody.
welcome. Have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye.